Everyone's got something they feel is underappreciated, and it could be anything: a music band, a food, flushing public toilets. But what about a video game console? Now we're talking. One of our favorite things to love. Now, I suppose if we were in a grateful mood, we could appreciate that older game consoles are appreciated in any capacity. After all, not everything from the past still gets appreciated years later. In the case of the TurboGrafx-16 and Neo Geo, we have two consoles with two very devout fan bases, considered by many to be the runner-ups to the most popular home consoles of the fourth generation, aka these are the consoles that are not the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo. So, between the Neo Geo and TurboGrafx-16, which console is more underappreciated? Except, if one console is determined to be more underappreciated, wouldn't that make the other console become even more underappreciated than it was before? Well, either way, a great case could be made for each of these consoles. I mean, personally, I'd love all game consoles to be more appreciated. In fact, I started doing something I call Feel Good Fridays, where me and the consoles all hang out and just talk about what a great job everybody's been doing. But when it comes to the Neo Geo and TurboGrafx-16 being underappreciated, a lot of it comes down to branding and price. With the TurboGrafx-16, it seemed to get plenty of coverage in magazines initially, but just wasn't able to tap into early 90s gaming culture the way Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis did. Heck, a lot of people didn't even know what a TurboGrafx-16 was back in the day, and some of you watching may still not know what it is. In which case, let me tell ya, the TurboGrafx-16 is the localized and rebranded version of a console from Japan called the PC Engine, which did well over there, but not so much over here. The TurboGrafx-16 was one of those consoles where if somebody had one back in the day, they were likely known as that kid that had a TurboGrafx-16. A lot better than some of the other things kids could have been known for. Part of the TurboGrafx-16's problem was that the console just didn't have the same sort of presence in stores, which were, you know, where most people bought stuff back then. Plus, Nintendo had a bit of a stranglehold when it came to shelf space with retailers, and Sega had to fight really hard for a while to get the shelf space that they did end up with. The TurboGrafx-16 wasn't going to just waltz in and be the featured console that stores would emphasize in their displays. When it came to the Neo Geo, yeah, it wasn't exactly plastered all over store shelves either, but the bigger issue was its price. People were certainly interested in the Neo Geo, but the Neo Geo was like that person of your dreams you wanted to go out with, but was unavailable because they were already dating somebody else. And the Neo Geo was dating a price tag of $650, and the two of them were caught smooching each other all the time. In retail stores, that is. I should point out that some people have reported being able to place phone and magazine orders for $550 prior to the widely reported summer of '91 release date. Either way, that was a ton of money back in the 90s. It did come with two pretty sweet arcade sticks and a game, and then eventually released in a set called the Silver System that only had one arcade stick and no games for $400. But then, of course, there were the son of a barnacle prices for the games themselves. They were super expensive, generally costing a minimum of $100 each, and sometimes as high as $300 each. It makes sense though. I mean, it was actual arcade hardware. A Neo Geo cartridge is no joke, consisting of two massive boards. Some of these games were hundreds of megs too. Not cheap for a cartridge. You were paying for a luxury, not for everyone type of experience. And SNK never intended the Neo Geo to be anything more than that, openly discriminating against weenie gamers. Weenie gamers like to play video games too, you know. Imagine if a restaurant marketed themselves this way. If SNK wanted to sell their console to more people, they would have come up with something less costly to produce that they could have sold for less like Sega and Nintendo did. And yeah, they sort of did that with the Neo Geo CD, but that was years later and was still really expensive. So price kept most people away from the Neo Geo back in the day, but the TurboGrafx-16 actually seemed relatively affordable, launching for roughly $200 depending where you bought it. Seemed relatively affordable, that is until somebody realized the console required you to purchase additional accessories just to perform basic functions like multiplayer and composite video. Wait, where's the accessory for a power light and reset button? That would have been hot. Not to mention, there was also the expensive Turbo CD attachment for playing CD games, considered by many to be an essential part of the console's library. Sure, there was the Sega CD, but that came out later than the Turbo CD, and many Genesis owners were perfectly happy without it. Also, keep in mind that the TurboGrafx-16's launch price of roughly $200 was still $10 more than the launch price of the Genesis, so even if it was just barely, being more expensive than the Genesis, even without all the accessories, wasn't helping its marketability. Others would tell you that a big problem for the TurboGrafx-16 was that too many of its good games stayed in Japan and never came out in the States. Sega Saturn says, hi! Castlevania Rondo of Blood sure seems like it would have been popular. And yeah, the CD games were region-free, but the import scene back then wasn't anything close to what it is now. But all these reasons aside, the TurboGrafx-16 just never developed the kind of strong brand recognition outside of Japan that Nintendo and Sega both had with their consoles, and that made it really hard to compete. Maybe they should have gone after the weenie gamer demographic that the Neo Geo abandoned. But while it could be said the TurboGrafx-16 didn't have strong brand recognition, interestingly enough, it could be said that the Neo Geo did. After all, the Neo Geo was first and foremost a fairly popular arcade machine. So, while a lot of people never got to play the home console version, whether Timmy would let you have a turn on his system or not, they did still get to play Neo Geo in its arcade cabinet form. All you needed to play it were some quarters. Just gotta scrounge underneath your couch cushions. Hey, found me some Neo Geo. But people liked Neo Geo games back then. It got respect. That's part of why people salivated over the home console version so much. They just couldn't afford it. But again, the silver lining was always that you could still play the arcade cabs, which people loved to do. For this reason, I would say that overall the Neo Geo was more appreciated back in the day. But what about nowadays? Well, nowadays the TurboGrafx-16 has joined the Neo Geo as a prohibitively expensive console. Darn. Well, that's just what happens to good systems that didn't sell well back in the day. Sega Saturn says hi! Although, it should be noted that the Turbo becomes slightly less expensive when you go the Japanese route. Not to mention, you get a larger game library. Most people go for the Duo consoles like I did, because that way you get the ability to play the console's CD games built right in, which many consider an essential part of the system's library. Unlike the Genesis and Sega CD, where a lot of people, whether they should or not, just ignore the Sega CD. Don't feel too bad for it, it's used to it by now. But as far as accessibility overall goes, it feels like Neo Geo games have been re-released and made available far more often than TurboGrafx games have been. For the Turbo, other than having some games released on the Wii Virtual Console, which is now shut down, and the TurboGrafx-16 Mini, which is now only available secondhand, you don't find its games made available officially in many other ways, though there are some exceptions here and there. For example, you might be thinking you can still download TurboGrafx games on the Wii U, but as of the time of this video, that's been sentenced to death. Don't feel too bad for it, it's pretty used to death by now. But compared to the Neo Geo, we've been given a ton of different ways to play some of its games, making it fairly accessible to play Neo Geo games over the years. Okay, but speaking of games, how about them? Well, what's interesting about these two consoles is that they each have a reputation for specializing in one genre. For the Neo Geo, it's 2D fighters, and for the TurboGrafx-16, it's 2D shooters, although they both certainly have good games in other genres as well, as fans of each console will gladly enlighten you. I would say the Neo Geo has more household names though, King of Fighters, Samurai Showdown, and Metal Slug being some of the more notable ones, whereas the Turbo's most household name would be Bonk, maybe? Actually, I think it would definitely be Bomberman. I bring up Bomberman in conversation around the house all the time, but Bomberman has been all over the place to the point some people don't even associate it with the TurboGrafx-16. But other than Bomberman, yeah, as great as games like Spriggan, Soldier Blade, and Lords of Thunder are, they are reserved for those hardcore enough to know what they are and appreciate them. Not that every console doesn't have at least some games that are great without big name recognition. I do think it's important to keep in mind that in a lot of ways, many of the games and franchises from the TurboGrafx-16 were essentially left to die with the console itself. And as of this video, Konami owns the rights to the console and a lot of its properties, so don't get your hopes up. Also, if you're looking for an underappreciated genre on an underappreciated console, then look no further than the Alien Crush and Devil's Crush pinball games, considered by some to be the best pinball video games ever made, not a claim to be taken lightly. So yeah, as you can tell, I personally think the TurboGrafx-16 is the more underappreciated console. Overall, that is, the actual fans of either console are certainly doing their job when it comes to appreciating them. I thought of getting a banana tattooed on my arm, but then I just always want to eat one, although that's kind of already the case. Also, one more thing. I feel like I should mention that the lifespans of the Neo Geo and TurboGrafx-16 are totally different. The TurboGrafx-16, if you count the original Japanese iteration of it, the PC Engine, had a lifespan of roughly 1987 to 1994, where the Neo Geo, if you count the arcade iteration, had a lifespan of roughly 1990 to 2004. But other than that, that about does it for my take on this particular comparison. There's certainly a lot more that can be said about either console, some of which I've probably already covered in past videos, or will cover in future videos. But for this video's question, I'd just like to ask you what you've noticed in terms of each platform's popularity, and not just which console you personally like more, although I'd certainly be interested in that as well. So with that, leave your answer down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro, yeah, and he's talking about video games. He's the retro, oh yes, and he hopes that you like what he had to say.